The air in CECOT was always thick, a stew of sweat, disinfectant, and something else, something metallic and old like the taste of fear itself. Marco breathed it in, a dull ache behind his ribs, every day the same, every cell a mirror of the last. The concrete walls bled a perpetual dampness, a cold sweat mirroring the dread that clung to every man. Sunlight, when it found its way through the high barred windows, felt less like a blessing and more like an interrogation lamp, harsh and unforgiving, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the heavy air. Around him, the low murmur of voices never truly stopped, a constant hum of whispered deals, muttered threats, and the slow, grinding despair of men trapped. He watched, always watched, learning the small, unspoken rules. The flicker in a man's eyes that meant trouble. The way a plate was passed that signaled a debt owed. Survival here was a quiet art, a constant calibration of who to trust, who to avoid, and how to make himself invisible when the guards walked their rounds, their boots echoing like doom down the long corridors. Marco had seen men arrive with fire in their eyes, men who thought they were tougher than the walls, tougher than the system. He had seen that fire extinguished, replaced by a vacant stare, a broken spirit. He refused to become one of them. His goal was simple, primal, just to keep breathing, to see another morning, to not give in to the suffocating weight of this place. He carried his past like a ghost, a heavy shroud that never quite left him alone. But here, in CECOT, the past was a luxury, a weakness even. Only the present mattered, the immediate moment, the next meal, the next shift of the guards, the next face that looked at him with hunger or hostility. The tension was a living thing, a coiled snake in the belly of the prison, always ready to strike. It manifested in the sharp glint in a gang leader's eye, the sudden hush when a new inmate was brought in, the way men avoided certain corners of the yard. Marco felt it, a low thrumming beneath his skin, a warning that something was always on the verge of breaking, that the fragile peace of the prison was merely a thin crust over a boiling resentment. He knew he was just a piece in a larger, unseen game, but for now, his only game was staying alive. The fragile peace Marco relied on shattered one humid afternoon in the communal eating area. A young man, barely more than a boy, new to their block, had accidentally bumped into one of Los Demonios, a mistake that would prove costly. The plate of watery beans crashed to the floor, and a collective hush fell, heavier than the usual silence. Marco watched from his corner, his stomach tightening. El Diablo, the Demonios' leader, a man whose eyes held a permanent chill, slowly rose from his bench. He did not speak immediately, just walked towards the trembling boy, his shadow lengthening ominously across the stained concrete. Then, his voice, low and dangerous, cut through the tension. "You owe us, boy," he said, not asking, stating a fact. The boy stammered, his face white, searching desperately for an escape. El Diablo's gaze then swept past the boy, landing squarely on Marco, a calculated, piercing stare that felt like a physical blow. "And you," El Diablo rumbled, his voice carrying surprising volume for its low tone. "You see what happens when you do not pick a side." He paused, letting the words hang, a heavy, unspoken threat. "We are moving some things tonight, little things, nothing the guards will notice, but we need extra hands, quiet hands." His eyes fixed on Marco, demanding an answer without asking a question. "Are you with us, or are you just another piece of trash that gets swept away?" The message was clear, unmistakable. Marco knew turning away meant marking himself as an enemy, a target, perhaps worse than the terrified boy, his breath caught in his throat. The choice was not really a choice, not if he wanted to see another morning. He had to say yes, he had to join. The price of neutrality, he understood then, was far too high. Marco's nod was almost imperceptible. A slight dip of his head, but it was enough for El Diablo. A cruel, knowing smile played on the leader's lips, a silent acknowledgement of Marco's reluctant compliance. The air, thick with unspoken menace, slowly began to lighten as El Diablo turned away, his point made, his power reasserted. The boy, still shaking, was dragged off by two of El Diablo's enforcers, his fate left to the grim imaginings of those who watched. Marco felt a cold knot in his stomach, a blend of fear and a strange, nascent guilt. He had survived, but at what cost? He had crossed a line, a significant one, stepping from the precarious safety of observer into the dangerous realm of participant. Later that evening, as the last traces of daylight bled from the sky, Marco found himself among a small group of demonios, huddled in a shadowy corner of the yard, pretending to be engaged in a casual conversation, while El Diablo delivered instructions in a low conspiratorial whisper. The task was simple enough, at least on the surface, moving contraband, likely drugs or smuggled cell phones, from one cell block to another, through a series of seldom-used utility tunnels beneath the prison. But as El Diablo spoke, outlining the path, mentioning specific turns and dark passages, Marco felt a strange chill that had nothing to do with the night air. There was a particular tunnel, he explained, one that connected their block to the main infirmary, rarely checked by guards, but known, he added with a slight, almost imperceptible shiver, to be unlucky. He did not elaborate, merely cautioned them to be swift and silent when passing through it. Marco glanced at the other men, hardened faces, but he noticed a subtle shift in their demeanor at the mention of this tunnel, a tightening around their eyes, a brief, almost imperceptible intake of breath. It was more than just the danger of being caught. There was a faint, almost imperceptible odor in the air, a scent of damp earth mingled with something else, something metallic and strangely sweet, that Marco couldn't quite place. It clung to the old stones, a ghost of a smell, a whisper of something ancient and unsettling. He had heard the hushed rumors since he arrived, whispers of strange sounds, of shadows that moved on their own, of men who went into certain parts of the prison and never quite came back the same, if they came back at all. Most of it he had dismissed as prison folklore, stories to scare the new fish. But as El Diablo's words about the unlucky tunnel echoed in his mind and that strange, cloying smell seemed to intensify around him, a prickle of unease ran down Marco's spine. The unwritten laws of the prison, he was learning, extended beyond the guards and the gangs. There were other, older rules, he suspected, rules that governed the very stones of CECOT, rules that sometimes manifested in ways that defied explanation, a faint, lingering scent of something unnatural in the air. The designated hour arrived, a moonless night. The prison plunged into a deeper darkness than usual. Marco, along with two other reluctant recruits and a couple of El Diablo's trusted enforcers, navigated the labyrinthine corridors. The air grew colder as they descended into the utility tunnels, the smell of damp earth and that strange metallic sweetness becoming more pronounced. The low hum of the prison machinery was replaced by the drip, drip, drip of unseen water, an unnerving soundtrack to their clandestine journey. Their footsteps, soft as they tried to be, echoed unsettlingly in the confined space. As they approached the unlucky tunnel, a palpable shift occurred among the group. The enforcers, usually stoic and unyielding, began to exchange nervous glances. One of them, a bulky man named Santos, notorious for his unshakable demeanor, actually stumbled. Catching himself on the rough concrete wall with a gasp, he quickly recovered, his face a mask of feigned indifference, but Marco caught the momentary terror in his eyes. The air grew heavy, almost oppressive, a weight pressing down on their chests. A cold draft snaked through the tunnel, even though there was no apparent opening. It carried with it a faint, mournful whisper, a sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, a collective sigh of forgotten souls. Marco tried to rationalize it, attributing it to the acoustics of the tunnel, the stress of the mission, the fear of being caught. But then, as they passed a particularly dark alcove, a fleeting shadow detached itself from the wall, elongated, then vanished into the deeper darkness ahead. It moved too swiftly, too fluidly, to be a trick of the light or a rat. His breath hitched. He wasn't the only one who saw it. He noticed another recruit, a young man named Luis, freeze mid-step, his eyes wide with an unspeakable terror. Luis opened his mouth to speak, but Santos clamped a hand over his mouth, his own face pale. "No talking," Santos hissed, his voice barely audible. "Just move." They pushed forward, driven by the urgency of their task and the growing, creeping dread. Marco felt a chilling presence, not just the cold air, but a sensation of being watched, of something ancient and malevolent stirring in the darkness around them. He could almost taste the fear in the air, a metallic tang on his tongue. This wasn't just about avoiding the guards anymore. This was about something else, something lurking beneath the very foundations of CECOT, something that had been waiting in the shadows long before any of them had arrived. The whispered rumors, the subtle shifts in demeanor, the strange, pervasive smells, they coalesced into a terrifying reality. The supernatural wasn't just a story here. It was a palpable, terrifying force, woven into the very fabric of the prison. And they had just stepped directly into its path. They emerged from the unlucky tunnel into the relative normalcy of the infirmary block's basement, the illicit package safely delivered. The immediate threat of the supernatural presence seemed to recede, replaced by the more tangible, yet no less dangerous, threat of discovery by the guards. Marco felt a wave of relief, quickly followed by a deepening unease. The shadows, the whispers, the fleeting form, they were not easily dismissed. He saw the same haunted look in the eyes of Santos and the others, a shared understanding of what they had just encountered. The bonds forged in that moment of shared terror, however, were fragile, built on a foundation of fear, not trust. Back in their cell block, the camaraderie among the demonios was a brittle thing. El Diablo, satisfied with the mission's success, still maintained an iron grip, his paranoia a constant, suffocating presence. Marco noticed the subtle shifts, the guarded conversations, the suspicious glances exchanged when El Diablo wasn't looking. The power dynamics were intricate, a delicate balance of alliances and resentments. He overheard fragments of conversations, whispers about territory disputes, about missing cuts of profits, about men who were getting too ambitious. The prison system itself, a vast, oppressive machine, was another constant threat. The guards, ever watchful, conducted random searches, shakedowns, and cell transfers, arbitrary acts of power designed to keep the inmates on edge, to prevent any real sense of stability or unity. A week later, the cracks in their fragile alliance began to show, starting with a seemingly minor incident. A stash of contraband cigarettes, carefully hidden, went missing from El Diablo's personal reserve. The accusation fell swiftly and heavily on a low-ranking member named Carlos, a quiet man who had also been part of the tunnel run. El Diablo's fury was a terrifying thing, a storm of curses and threats. Carlos vehemently denied the theft, his eyes wide with genuine fear, but El Diablo was unmoved. Marco watched, helpless, as Carlos was dragged away for interrogation, knowing what that entailed in the brutal hierarchy of the prison. The incident, small as it was, created a ripple of distrust throughout the block. Everyone eyed everyone else with suspicion, wondering who would be next, who was truly loyal, who might be trying to destabilize El Diablo's control. Marco felt a cold dread settle in. He knew Carlos hadn't taken the cigarettes. Carlos was too afraid, too insignificant to cross El Diablo in such a blatant way. The theft felt orchestrated, a deliberate act to sow discord, a test. But by whom? Was it an internal power play from within Los Demonios, someone trying to undermine El Diablo? Or was it something else, something from outside? He thought about the guards, their calculated brutality, their constant efforts to keep the inmates divided. And then, a darker thought, a shiver down his spine. Could it be the unseen presence from the tunnels, the force that seemed to feed on fear and chaos? The lines between the known dangers and the unknown ones were blurring, twisting into a dangerous knot. The prison, he realized, was not just a place of concrete and bars, but a volatile ecosystem where every act of betrayal, every crack in loyalty, served to weaken them all, making them more vulnerable to the many threats that lurked within its walls, both human and something far less tangible. The disappearance of Carlos, the chilling screams that had faintly echoed from the isolation wing, and the palpable tension within the block solidified Marco's conviction that the missing cigarettes were no random theft. He watched El Diablo, the leader's eyes darting, his usual swagger replaced by a restless energy. The incident had unnerved even him, suggesting a power at play beyond his immediate control. The uncertainty, Marco realized, was a weapon, and someone was wielding it with cruel precision. One particularly sweltering afternoon, during their brief yard time, Marco found himself near Luis, the young man who had also been part of the unlucky tunnel run. Luis, usually withdrawn, looked gaunt, his eyes sunken, as if he hadn't slept in days. He fidgeted constantly, glancing over his shoulder, a hunted look about him. Marco decided to risk it, speaking in a low voice, almost a murmur. "You saw it too, didn't you, in the tunnel?" Marco asked, his voice carefully neutral. Luis flinched, his head snapping towards Marco, a jolt of recognition and terror flashing in his eyes. He hesitated, then leaned in closer, his voice a barely audible whisper, laced with a raw desperation. "More than that," he breathed. "I heard it, later, back in the cell. Whispers, Marco, like they were right next to my ear. Telling me things, ugly things, about us, about this place. And then the dreams started, of the old prison, before CECOT was built, of the men who died here." Luis went on, his words tumbling out in a rush, a dam breaking. He spoke of historical records he had stumbled upon during a brief stint in the prison library, an old, almost forgotten section. He had found mentions of an ancient burial ground, a place of sacrifice, upon which the original prison, the one CECOT was built over, had been constructed. The records spoke of strange occurrences, of unexplained deaths, of a pervasive malice that clung to the very earth. The original prison, it seemed, had been cursed, built on desecrated ground, and CECOT was merely its modern, larger manifestation, a new skin over old, festering wounds. The whispers, Luis believed, were the echoes of the tormented souls trapped within the walls, their suffering fueling something dark and hungry. Marco felt a cold dread spread through him, colder than any fear of the guards. This wasn't just a prison anymore, it was a tomb, a living nightmare built on a foundation of ancient pain. The contraband theft, Carlos's disappearance, the growing paranoia within Los Demonios, it all began to make a terrible, twisted sense. The malevolent presence in the tunnels wasn't just lurking, it was actively influencing, twisting, corrupting. It was feeding on their fear, their distrust, their violence, turning them against each other, weakening them from within. The unlucky tunnel was merely a vein connecting to a much larger, darker heart beneath the prison. The enemy wasn't just El Diablo, or the guards, or even the unseen entity in isolation. It was the prison itself, a sentient, malevolent force rooted in ancient desecration, and it was playing them all, a puppet master pulling strings of fear and suspicion. This discovery changed everything. Their fight for survival wasn't just against human enemies, but against the very soul of CECOT, an ancient evil feeding on their torment. An escape, Marco realized, would not just be from the bars and guards, but from a deeper, more insidious prison. Defined. The revelation from Luis hung heavy in the air, a suffocating shroud of ancient malice. Marco felt a profound shift in his understanding of CECOT, a terrifying reorientation. The physical prison, with its concrete and steel, was merely a vessel for something far older, far darker. The guards, El Diablo, their petty struggles, they were all just players on a stage set by an unseen, malevolent hand. This new knowledge, however, brought a chilling clarity. It explained the unshakable fear, the pervasive dread, the illogical twists of fortune that seemed to plague the prison. Luis, emboldened by Marco's silent understanding, began to speak more freely, sharing details of his research, of the small, almost imperceptible shifts in the prison's atmosphere that he had come to notice. He spoke of how the whispers, once subtle, were now almost constant, weaving doubts and resentments into the minds of the inmates, stirring old grudges, amplifying new ones. He believed the entity, or entities, were actively working to fracture any unity, making them easier prey. Their quiet conversation, however, had not gone unnoticed. Later that night, as the communal lights flickered and dimmed, signaling the official end of the day, a small, heavily muscled man named Rico, one of El Diablo's most brutal enforcers, approached Marco's cell. Rico had been present during the first tunnel run, a silent observer whose eyes always seemed to miss nothing. He leaned against the bars, his face obscured by shadow, his voice a low growl. El Diablo wants to know what you and Luis were whispering about, Rico said, his tone devoid of inflection, yet heavy with threat. Secrets here. They cost more than just a few cigarettes. Marco felt a jolt of panic. Had Luis's vulnerability, his desperation, exposed them both? He tried to feign ignorance, to play down the conversation as simple inmate chatter, but Rico merely smiled, a slow, unpleasant baring of teeth. Don't bother, Marco. We know about the old stories, about Luis and his library time. El Diablo, he does not like secrets he is not a part of. Then the true nature of the trap sprung. Rico's hand, surprisingly nimble, snaked through the bars of Marco's cell, pressing a small, tightly folded piece of paper into his palm. A message, Rico whispered. From El Diablo, for you to deliver. To the leader of the Lobos, in Block D, tonight. And you will tell him, Marco, that El Diablo is ready to make a deal, a truce, for protection from the shadows. Rico paused, his eyes glinting with a cold, unsettling amusement. But you will also tell him that Luis, your little friend, he is the one who has been talking to the guards, feeding them information about the Lobos' movements. You will tell them that Luis is the snitch. Marco's blood ran cold. This was it, the first betrayal, and it was being forced upon him. The deal was a cynical ploy, a calculated move by El Diablo to remove Luis, to sow further discord between rival gangs, and to test Marco's loyalty, or rather, his willingness to sacrifice another. If he refused, he would be next. If he complied, he would be directly responsible for Luis's brutal end. The whispers in the prison, the malevolent presence, they were not just feeding on fear, but actively orchestrating these acts of betrayal. They were forcing men to choose, to become monsters, to sacrifice others for their own survival. Marco looked at the crumpled paper in his hand, a tangible symbol of his dissent. a physical mark of the choice he was being forced to make. The cost of survival was no longer just fear, but a piece of his soul. He had to decide to betray his only confidant or face El Diablo's wrath. The weight of the decision was crushing, a heavy stone in his gut. The entity was winning, twisting them into its own image. The crumpled note felt like a venomous snake in Marco's palm, its edges digging into his skin, a physical manifestation of the moral poison he was forced to ingest. He spent a sleepless night, the air thick with the silent accusations of his conscience. The choice, stark and brutal, had been laid before him. His own life, or Luis's, the whispers, now, felt personal, a demonic chorus urging him toward the path of self-preservation, mocking his internal struggle. He could feel the malevolence of the prison pressing in, delighting in his torment. By morning, a decision, born of desperation and the primal urge to survive, had calcified in his mind. He would deliver the message. He would betray Luis. The words tasted like ash on his tongue, but the alternative was unthinkable, a cold, hard certainty of his own demise. He rationalized it, told himself Luis was already too deep, too vulnerable, too marked by the prison's dark influence. It was a lie he desperately needed to believe. The delivery was swift, a clandestine exchange during morning yard time, disguised as a casual bump against a member of the Lobos. The message found its way to their leader, a hulking, scarred man named Salazar. Marco watched, a knot in his stomach, as the information about Luis, the supposed snitch, began to circulate. A ripple of malice spreading through the Lobos. He saw the cold glint in Salazar's eyes as he glanced towards Luis, who stood oblivious in a corner, lost in his own tortured thoughts. The consequences were immediate and brutal. Within hours, Luis was cornered by two of Salazar's men. There was no interrogation, no plea for explanation, just a swift, merciless assault in a blind spot of the yard, out of sight of the distant guard towers. Marco heard the sickening thuds, the stifled cries, the guttural grunts of the attackers. He didn't look, couldn't look. He just stared at the scarred concrete, the images of the tunnel, of Luis's terrified face flashing behind his eyes. When the commotion died down, Luis was left crumpled on the ground, a broken heap, his face a pulpy mess, his body barely moving. He was dragged away by the guards, presumably to the infirmary, or perhaps directly to isolation, never to be seen in their block again. A chilling calm settled over the cell block. El Diablo gave Marco a curt, approving nod, a silent acknowledgement of his loyalty. The Lobos, appeased for now, glared at the demonios, but their immediate anger was directed elsewhere, at the phantom traitor. But the sense of relief Marco felt was fleeting, poisoned by an overwhelming wave of guilt and self-loathing. He had saved himself, but he had sacrificed an innocent. He had become part of the darkness he sought to escape. And the whispers now were louder. They were not just in his ears, but in his mind, echoing the agony of Luis, twisting his own thoughts, reminding him of his complicity. They spoke of the unfairness, the cruelty, the way men were forced to turn on each other in this place. The strange metallic smell of the tunnels seemed to cling to him, even in his cell, a constant reminder of the malevolent presence that reveled in their suffering. The air in the prison felt heavier, charged with a thick, almost tangible despair. The violence had escalated, the fear had intensified, and Marco knew, with a horrifying certainty, that this was precisely what the ancient evil beneath CECOT desired. It fed on their broken trust, on their desperate choices, on the blood spilled in its name. He had played his part, and the prison had claimed another piece of his soul. The path out, if one existed, felt further away than ever, shrouded in a deepening darkness. The ghost of Louis haunted Marco, a silent, accusing specter in his waking hours, and a terrifying presence in his nightmares. His survival felt like a heavy chain, each link forged from guilt. The prison, meanwhile, simmered, a pressure cooker of escalating paranoia. The whispers Luis had warned him about, the ones that amplified grudges and sowed discord, were now undeniable. They slithered through the cells, twisting facts, conjuring suspicions, turning inmate against inmate with insidious precision. The fragile truce between the demonios and the lobos, orchestrated by El Diablo through Luis's sacrifice, was a thin veneer over a boiling cauldron of resentment. One evening, Marco overheard El Diablo and Rico arguing in low, heated tones near the guard station. Their faces were grim, their voices hushed, but Marco caught fragments. "The guards know too much," Rico hissed. "They're tightening the screws, a new shakedown every other day." "Someone's talking." El Diablo pounded a fist against the concrete wall, a muffled thud that still carried the weight of his frustration. "It's not just the guards," he snarled. "Things are disappearing from our stashes. Not just cigarettes, bigger things. And the money, it's not adding up." The paranoia had turned inward, devouring even the demonios themselves. Marco realized the scale of the problem. The whispers were not just about personal vendettas, they were about undermining the entire system of control within the prison. The constant disappearances, the escalating vigilance of the guards, the financial discrepancies, it all pointed to a deeper, more pervasive sabotage. The entity wasn't content with merely feeding on their fear. It was actively dismantling their world, pushing them to the brink. Then a new plan for escape began to circulate, a desperate, whispered hope among a small, disparate group of inmates, men from different blocks, different gangs, who shared a common desperation. Marco learned of it through a series of subtle glances, coded messages passed during yard time, the kind of communication born from years of imprisonment. The plan was audacious, involving the utility tunnels, a coordinated diversion, and a corrupted guard. It was risky, almost suicidal, but it was a plan, a tangible thread of hope in the suffocating darkness. Marco, despite his guilt, found himself drawn to it. This was his chance, not just to escape the physical confines of CECOT, but to escape the psychological prison he had built around himself, the one where Luis's ghost resided. He made contact, cautiously, with the central figure of this nascent rebellion, a quiet, older man known only as El Viejo, respected by many for his wisdom and his history. El Viejo, too, had felt the malevolence of the prison, the deepening shadows, the escalating chaos. He believed this was their only way out, a desperate bid for freedom before the prison consumed them all. The initial meetings were fraught with tension, suspicion thick in the air. Marco could feel the echoes of Luis's betrayal, the entity's influence, trying to poison this fragile alliance before it could even form. But the shared desperation, the growing certainty that CECOT was a living, malevolent entity, outweighed their individual fears and loyalties. A fragile consensus emerged. They would work together, a small band of unlikely allies, united against the prison itself. But just as a glimmer of hope began to break through Marco's despair, a crushing blow landed. Rico, looking grim, pulled Marco aside, his voice barely a whisper. "The plan, the escape," Rico sounded, his eyes scanning their surroundings for eavesdroppers. "It's a trap. A rat inside our own ranks fed information to the guards. El Viejo, he's been moved to isolation. The tunnels, they're crawling with extra guards. They were waiting." Marco felt the world tilt, the fragile hope he had nurtured, the desperate chance at redemption. It all crumbled to dust. The prison, the entity, had won again. It had used their desperation, their fleeting unity, against them. The sense of being utterly trapped, of being played by an unseen, malevolent force settled deep within his bones. The escape was a mirage, and the cost of believing in it, for El Viejo, was swift and brutal. The dark night of his soul had truly begun. The news of El Viejo's capture, the utter collapse of the escape plan, struck Marco with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just the loss of freedom, the dashed hopes. It was the crushing realization that the prison, or whatever ancient malevolence resided within it, was always one step ahead. It knew their desires, their weaknesses, and it exploited them with a cruel, almost intelligent precision. The walls of his cell seemed to press in, suffocating him not just with concrete, but with an overwhelming sense of despair and futility. He lay on his hard cot, staring at the dimly lit ceiling, the cold, stale air, a constant reminder of his confinement. The whispers were no longer external, they were internal, echoing in the hollow chambers of his mind. They spoke of Luis, of his terrified eyes, of the screams that had been silenced because Marco had chosen himself. They spoke of El Viejo, a good man, now suffering in isolation, his hope twisted into another tool for the prison's malevolence. He saw the faces of all the men he had known in CECOT, men broken, men consumed, men who had tried and failed. Their failures became his own. He felt the heavy weight of his own crimes, the ones that had landed him in CECOT, crimes he had tried to bury under layers of self-preservation. But here, in this abyss, with no escape in sight, they clawed their way back to the surface. He saw the faces of his victims, heard their cries, felt the cold touch of his own callousness. His past, his present, his future, all intertwined into an agonizing knot of guilt and regret. He was no better than El Diablo, no better than the guards, no better than the entity that fed on their despair. He had become an instrument of the prison's will, a betrayer, a survivalist at any cost. The darkness of CECOT wasn't just a lack of light, it was a pervasive, existential gloom that seeped into the soul, corrupting everything it touched. He felt stripped bare, his layers of defense, of denial, peeled away by the relentless pressure of this place. There was no one to blame but himself, for his choices, for his compromises, for the path he had walked. He had survived, yes, but at what cost? He was alive, but was he truly living? The question echoed in the emptiness of his being, a mocking refrain. A profound weariness settled over him, deeper than any physical exhaustion. It was the weariness of a spirit on the verge of breaking, of a man who had faced his own moral bankruptcy. He realized then that the escape he truly craved was not from the physical walls but from the darkness within himself, the darkness that CECOT had so expertly brought to the surface. He had reached his rock bottom, a place where all illusions of self-worth had been stripped away, leaving only the raw, aching core of his failures and his complicity. The prison had shown him his true reflection, and it was a horrifying sight. There was no hope left, only a crushing, absolute despair. He had betrayed others, but most profoundly, he had betrayed himself. He had become everything he had sworn he would not be, and the whispers, a cacophony of lost souls, celebrated his descent. From the crushing depths of his despair, a flicker, almost imperceptible, began to stir within Marco. It wasn't hope in the traditional sense, but a fierce, primal refusal to simply succumb. He had stared into the abyss of his own making, and what he saw, while horrifying, also clarified something. He could not undo his betrayals, but he could choose how he would face the end. He could choose not to be a puppet any longer, not for El Diablo, not for the guards, and certainly not for the malevolent force that fed on their misery. The whispers, though still present, now felt less like a personal torment and more like a challenge. They wanted him broken, yes, but perhaps there was a defiant act left within him. This realization was a slow burn, a quiet defiance growing in the core of his being. He would not give the entity the satisfaction of consuming his spirit entirely. His opportunity came unexpectedly, during a rare, chaotic period. A violent brawl erupted in the yard, a calculated distraction orchestrated by some of the remaining desperate souls who had clung to El Viejo's failed escape. In the ensuing chaos, with guards overwhelmed and cell blocks temporarily unlocked to manage the incident, Marco found himself standing near Rico. Rico, too, looked utterly defeated, the swagger gone from his posture, his eyes hollow. The relentless pressure of the prison, the failed escape, the constant betrayals had clearly taken its toll on him as well. Marco made eye contact, a silent acknowledgement of their shared predicament, their shared fear. He spoke low, his voice raw, stripped of pretense. "They want us to fight each other, Rico," he said, not asking, stating a fact. "They want us broken, one by one. El Viejo, Luis, they were just the beginning. This place, it feeds on it." Rico, surprisingly, did not retort with a threat or a sneer. He merely stared at Marco, a flicker of something resembling understanding in his eyes. The common enemy, the unseen, pervasive malice of CECOT, had begun to erode the old loyalties, the old hatreds. "El Diablo, he's losing it," Rico muttered, glancing around nervously. "He thinks everyone is a snitch, a traitor. He trusts no one, not even his own shadow." Marco saw his opening. "And what about you, Rico?" Marco pressed, his voice firm. "Do you want to die in this tomb, consumed by its hunger? Or do you want to fight back, truly fight back, against what's really here?" He wasn't appealing to friendship, or even trust, but to the raw animal instinct for survival that still burned in Rico, beneath layers of brutality. He was appealing to the shared terror of the prison's true nature. Rico hesitated, weighing the words, the implications. He looked towards the darkened corridors, then back at Marco. He saw not a weakling, but a man who had faced his own darkness and emerged with a fierce resolve. The moment stretched, fraught with danger and fragile possibility. Then, slowly, with a barely perceptible nod, Rico extended a hand, not for a handshake, but as an offering of alliance, a silent, desperate compact. "What do you have in mind?" Rico asked. His voice low, a new, dangerous glint in his eyes. Marco met his gaze, a grim determination setting in. "We stop playing their game," he said, his voice imbued with a newfound strength. "We stop betraying each other. We find the source of this rot, the place where this thing breathes, and we tear it down, or we die trying. But we die on our own terms, not theirs." It wasn't an escape plan, not anymore. It was a war, a desperate, impossible battle against the very essence of CECOT, against the ancient evil that claimed it as its feeding ground. And for the first time since Luis, a sliver of clarity, of purpose, ignited in Marco's soul. The alliance with Rico was a fragile, desperate thing, built not on friendship, but on a shared enemy and a mutual understanding of the prison's true, malevolent nature. They began to recruit, not openly, but through subtle signals and whispered conversations. They sought out men who had been touched by the whispers, men who had seen the shadows, men who felt the cold dread that permeated CECOT. Slowly, a small, unlikely band of allies formed, a mix of demonios, lobos, and independents, their petty gang rivalries temporarily overshadowed by the greater existential threat. Their plan was reckless, almost suicidal. They would exploit another planned distraction, a riot instigated by their new allies in a distant cell block to gain access to the utility tunnels. But this time, they weren't seeking escape. They were going deeper, to the source of the whispers, to the ancient burial ground Luis had described, to confront the entity directly. Rico, with his knowledge of the prison's hidden passages, proved invaluable. He knew forgotten service routes, disused ventilation shafts, and blind spots in the guard patrols. The night of the riot arrived, a symphony of screams, steel clanging, and the harsh shouts of guards echoing through the prison. Marco, Rico, and their small band slipped into the darkness of the utility tunnels. The air immediately grew colder, thicker with the metallic, sweet stench Marco now recognized as the entity's pervasive breath. The whispers intensified, a chorus of tormented voices urging them to turn back, to turn on each other, promising them pain and despair. They were right in his mind, sharp talons of doubt and fear tearing at his resolve. As they descended further, the tunnel walls seemed to twist and contort, the rough concrete giving way to older, cruder stone. The air was heavy, oppressive, a palpable weight pressing down on their chests. Then they reached it, a vast, cavernous space beneath the prison, unlike anything Marco had ever imagined. It was an ancient chamber, its rough-hewn walls adorned with crude, faded carvings, unsettling symbols that seemed to writhe in the dim light. In the center, a dark, pulsing altar of rough stone seemed to draw all the light and warmth from the cavern, emanating a pervasive, chilling malice. Around it, Marco saw skeletal remains, not just human, but strangely elongated, twisted, ancient. This was the burial ground, the place of sacrifice, the heart of CECOT's darkness. The entity was not a single form, but a swirling vortex of shadows and corrupted energy emanating from the altar, tendrils of darkness reaching out like grasping claws. It pulsed with a cold, malevolent intelligence, feeding on the fear and suffering of every soul trapped above. It spoke then, not with words, but with a collective roar of 1,000 tormented voices in their minds, a wave of pure anguish and hatred. "You cannot escape us," it boomed, its voice echoing in their skulls. "We are this place. We are your despair. You will feed us." Rico, usually so hardened, faltered, his face white with terror. Some of the others, overwhelmed by the psychic assault, clutched their heads, whimpering. But Marco, through sheer force of will, pushed back. He remembered Luis, El Viejo, his own guilt, the endless cycle of betrayal. He would not let this thing win. "No!" Marco roared, his voice raw but unwavering, a defiant counterpoint to the entity's scream. "You feed on fear, on weakness. We won't give it to you anymore. We choose our own end." Drawing on a surge of primal adrenaline, Marco grabbed a loose, heavy pipe from the tunnel floor. He charged towards the altar, a desperate, irrational act of defiance. Rico, witnessing Marco's sudden, reckless courage, found his own resolve. With a guttural shout, he followed, bullying the others. They were just men, armed with nothing but scraps of metal and a burning refusal to be consumed. The entity retaliated, sending waves of his psychic agony, images of their worst fears, their deepest regrets, crashing into their minds. It tried to turn them on each other, to resurrect old animosities, to shatter their fragile unity. One of the Lobos, his eyes glazed over, suddenly lunged at a Demonios, but Rico intercepted him, slamming him against the wall with a desperate plea for focus. Marco reached the altar, the pulsing heart of the entity, feeling its icy tendrils trying to seize his mind, to make him drop the pipe, to make him despair. He saw visions of his family, of moments of happiness, twisted into grotesque mockeries. He saw Luis's broken face, contorted in accusation. But he pushed through, fueled by a terrible, righteous fury. With a primal yell, he brought the pipe down, again and again, against the pulsing stone. The entity shrieked, a sound that tore at the fabric of reality, 1,000 voices crying out in pain and rage. The cavern shook, dust and debris raining down. The air crackled with raw, unstable energy. The ground beneath them trembled violently. The very walls of CECOT seemed to groan under the assault, as if the entire prison was dying. The ancient malice, it seemed, was not entirely invincible. Its power, rooted in the suffering of others, had a vulnerability, their unified defiance. Their physical attack on its symbolic heart was a direct assault on its very essence. The climax of their desperate war had begun, a battle not just for their lives, but for their very souls. The cavern writhed, a maelstrom of shadow and sound, as Marco struck the altar again and again. Each impact of the pipe against the ancient stone sent tremors through the earth, accompanied by a deafening shriek from the entity, a chorus of pain that threatened to shatter their sanity. The swirling vortex of darkness at the altar pulsed erratically, its tendrils recoiling, then lashing out with renewed fury. It was a chaotic, impossible battle, man against an unseen, ancient evil. Rico and the others, fighting through their own fear and the entity's psychic assault, joined Marco, some grabbing loose stones, others just screaming defiance. Their collective refusal to break, their combined will, seemed to momentarily disrupt the entity's hold. The whispers in Marco's mind, though still present, lost some of their cutting edge, becoming a more generalized cacophony, a weaker echo of its former power. Then, with a final desperate swing, Marco's pipe found a fissure in the pulsing altar stone. A blinding flash of dark energy erupted, followed by a guttural, earth-shattering roar that seemed to tear at the very foundations of the prison. The cavern plunged into absolute darkness, and the ground convulsed violently, throwing them all to the floor. Marco felt a searing pain, a burning sensation coursing through his arm as if he had grasped a live wire. He tasted blood, metallic and acrid, in his mouth. When the darkness slowly receded, replaced by the faint, eerie glow of emergency lights flickering somewhere above, the cavern was utterly transformed. The altar was shattered, reduced to fragments of dark, inert stone. The swirling vortex of shadows was gone, replaced by a lingering, cold emptiness. The malevolent presence, the suffocating oppression, had lifted. The whispers had ceased, replaced by an unsettling silence, broken only by their own ragged breaths. The air, though still damp, felt clean, scrubbed of its former sickness. Marco tried to push himself up, his muscles screaming in protest. His right arm, the one that had held the pipe, felt numb, yet strangely alive, with a faint, pulsing heat emanating from it. When he managed to sit up, he saw Rico, a grim smile on his bloodied face, pulling himself to his feet. The others, battered and bruised, but alive, were slowly stirring. They had done it. They had somehow, impossibly, defeated the ancient evil. But victory in CECOT always came with a price. The earthquake, or whatever seismic event their actions had triggered, had caused significant damage to the prison infrastructure. Alarms blared, distant shouts of guards echoed through the damaged corridors, and the frantic scramble of a prison in lockdown began. Escape in that moment was not an option. They were trapped, still. The guards, eventually, found them in the collapsed cavern. The scene was chaotic, dangerous, but strangely devoid of the usual oppressive dread. The guards, too, seemed disoriented, their faces pale, as if they had also felt the earth-shattering presence that had just been purged. Marco, along with Rico and the others, was dragged back to their cells, beaten, but with a new, quiet defiance in their eyes. His physical wounds were severe. His right arm, the one that had borne the brunt of the entity's dying surge, was badly burned, the flesh blistered and raw. The doctors, when they eventually came, were perplexed, unable to explain the strange, almost ritualistic patterns of the burns. But his deepest wounds were not physical. The ghosts of Luis and El Viejo remained, forever etched into his conscience. He had purged the external evil, but the internal one, the one born of his own betrayals, still festered. Yet something had shifted within him. The crushing despair had been replaced by a grim resolve. He had faced his own darkness, and he had fought against something far greater than himself. He carried the scars, both visible and invisible, but he also carried the memory of collective defiance, of a moment when men, broken and desperate, had chosen to fight for their souls, not just their lives. He was still in CECOT, still a prisoner, but he was fundamentally changed. The man who had entered the ancient cavern was not the same man who emerged. He had paid a terrible price, but in doing so, he had reclaimed a piece of his lost humanity. The true transformation had begun, not with escape, but with the choice to fight the darkness, both within and without. The aftermath of the cavern's collapse settled over CECOT like a thick, unnatural fog. The prison, though physically damaged, felt profoundly changed. The oppressive dread, the constant thrum of malice, had vanished. The air, though still stale, no longer carried the metallic sweetness of ancient evil. The whispers, too, were gone, leaving behind an unsettling, yet liberating, silence. The absence of that pervasive malevolence was a palpable thing, a weight lifted from every soul, even those who knew nothing of the cavern's secrets. Marco, recovering in the infirmary, bore the physical scars of his confrontation. His right arm, heavily bandaged, throbbed with a dull ache, a constant reminder of the raw power he had faced. The strange burn patterns remained, a permanent mark of his ordeal. But his true transformation was internal. The crippling guilt of Luis's betrayal, though still a shadow, no longer consumed him. He had paid a price, yes, a terrible one, but he had also made a different choice, a defiant one, at the precipice of ultimate despair. He had chosen to fight, not just for himself, but for a greater good, for the souls trapped within CECOT. Rico, surprisingly, was placed in the same infirmary ward, his own injuries less severe, but his demeanor equally altered. The hardened enforcer now carried a quiet solemnity, a profound awareness of what they had faced. There was no more bravado, no more posturing, just a shared, unspoken understanding between them, a bond forged in the crucible of their impossible battle. They had been enemies, then reluctant allies, and now something else, something akin to brothers in arms. The prison guards, still baffled by the structural damage and the strange, lingering cold in certain sections of the tunnels, implemented stricter rules, more frequent patrols, and enhanced security measures. The administration, trying to reassert control, blamed a large-scale inmate riot and an attempted escape for the chaos. They never fully grasped the true nature of what had transpired beneath their feet, the ancient evil that had once held dominion over their walls. The prison was still a prison, a brutal, unforgiving place, but its underlying malevolence had been purged. The very air had changed. El Diablo, deprived of the entity's insidious influence, found his power base crumbling. His paranoia, once amplified by the whispers, now consumed him from within. Without the external force feeding his cruelty and ambition, his gang fractured, his authority diminished, leaving him a shadow of his former tyrannical self. The petty gang wars continued, but with less fervor, less of the desperate, hate-fueled intensity that had once defined them. A fragile, uneasy peace began to settle over the prison, a consequence of the void left by the vanquished entity. Marco spent his days in quiet contemplation, observing the subtle shifts in the prison's atmosphere. He knew his time in CECOT was far from over, his sentence still stretching endlessly before him. The physical escape was still a distant dream, perhaps an impossible one. But he carried within him a different kind of freedom, a freedom from the internal torment that had once bound him. He had faced the darkness, both external and internal, and he had survived, transformed. He knew that the fight for humanity, for decency, for a shred of light in this oppressive world was a continuous one, even within the confines of CECOT. He would carry his scars, his memories, his profound understanding of betrayal and redemption. And as he looked out through the barred window of his cell, at the sliver of pale sky above the concrete walls, he felt a quiet strength, a resolve to live what remained of his life with purpose, to never again be a pawn in another's cruel game, human or otherwise. The story of CECOT and his place within it was far from over, but the darkest chapter had closed, leaving behind a hard-won, somber hope, a faint promise of a different future, one small act of defiance at a time.